What existed before everything we know began? Not before the first empire, nor before language, but before existence itself as we understand it. When there was no time, no matter, no sound, what filled this absolute void? Curiously, the oldest texts that have come down to us do not speak of a silence devoid of meaning, but of a specific type of stillness, a full silence, full. A silence where creation still rested in a latent state, awaiting the exact moment when the word would break the stillness. This pre-origin scenario continues to fascinate because it touches on something fundamental, the need for meaning before form. The world we inhabit today, complex, noisy, and fast-paced, was born from a moment without noise. It was not uncontrolled chaos that shaped everything, but an order that emerged from an intentional decision. Creation, at this starting point, is not only a physical event, but also a symbolic one. Each element carries with it a function and a value. Light does not emerge only as a natural phenomenon, but as a separation of what was indistinct. When light is created, night and day recognize each other, and for the first time, there is direction. It is intriguing to think that the earliest structure of existence was organized not only with force, but with words. Language precedes action, and this narrative choice carries profound implications. The universe does not begin with an uncontrolled bang, but with a simple, effective, and precise command. This conception reveals a moral dimension to existence. If everything begins with a voice, then perhaps listening is as important as creating. In ancient literature, the garden is the place where the order of the cosmos manifests itself in its purest form. There, every tree, every stone, every animal has a purpose. Nothing is left unattended or without a function. However, the perfection of this space does not lie in its absence of limits, but in their very existence. The garden is a gift, but also a territory under responsibility. It is granted, but it demands attention. Within this initial harmony, the human being emerges, made of ordinary matter, but animated by something that no other creature possesses. Breathing is not only a sign of life, but the transfer of a breath that carries identity. This is what gives humanity a unique role, to be a bridge between heaven and earth. But this privileged position does not come without choices. On the contrary, it inaugurates the possibility of decision. And at this point, the narrative shifts from physical creation to the creation of consciousness. If everything was done with words, it will also be through them that humanity will be called, guided, warned. The voice that once shaped the universe now speaks. And this dialogue is not superficial. It defines what is permitted, what is protected, and what can disrupt the balance. The space created to house this new humanity is not only beautiful, it is functional. The earth provides food, the waters quench thirst, the sky regulates cycles. But more than utility, this setting reflects an intention of relationship. The Creator does not just organize the world, He walks within it. This detail changes the entire dynamic. The transcendent draws near. Divinity is not limited to distant observation. It participates. However, it is precisely within this proximity that risk arises. Freedom is not the total absence of rules, it is the ability to choose within a proposed limit. And this limit does not arise as a punishment, but as an expression of trust. The Creator does not hide the possibilities. He openly declares what should and should not be done. The presence of a single forbidden fruit does not weaken freedom. It authenticates it. By presenting this condition, the text does not simply introduce an ancient story. It projects a structure that still challenges us today. Because we continue to live with the tension between what is given to us and what we want to take. We continue to inhabit spaces that require care, but which we often treat as if they were eternal, indestructible, or exclusively ours. Humanity's introduction into this perfectly tuned environment is accompanied by clear instructions, but also by a veiled invitation to listen. The voice that shaped the rivers and mountains also speaks directly to the being made of dust. And what is at stake in this relationship is not just obedience, but understanding one's own place in the universe. Listening becomes the first act of wisdom. When we consider this starting point, we realize that human drama does not begin with conflict, but with balance, with harmony between creator, creature, and creation. The initial beauty lies precisely in the fact that everything is in the right place at the right time with the right word. It is this alignment that sustains life before any shadow appears on the horizon. So we do not begin in ruin. We begin in plenitude. Human existence is born of care, order, and relationship. And it is within this framework that freedom will be put to the test, not as a threat, but as a greater expression of trust. Because where there is freedom, there is also the possibility of love. And where love is true, there is no need for imposition, only invitation. The story begins here, in the meaningful silence that precedes every choice. If creation began in a state of complete equilibrium, the emergence of freedom represented the first point of real tension. Not because there was error, but because within a harmonious universe, free will is the riskiest and, at the same time, the most revealing choice. It is at this point that the human being passes from being a contemplative creature to an active participant in what was created. The gift of freedom is not an adornment, it is part of identity. In the garden where everything was functional and beautiful, only one limit was established. A single fruit was declared off limits. In the face of an almost infinite abundance, focusing on a prohibition seems small, but it is precisely in this small point that the essential question lies. Why would something be forbidden in an environment of plenitude? The answer lies in the type of relationship that one wanted to build. If the Creator wanted absolute control, there would be no choice. But if what he sought was a free and true relationship, the existence of the limit was indispensable. Freedom, in this context, is not an open field without borders. It finds meaning in living with limits. And limits, in turn, are not punishment, but proof of trust. By declaring that everything may be enjoyed except a single tree, the Creator grants human beings a dignity that no other creature receives. The ability to choose not only between practical options, but between moral paths. Throughout human history, this same pattern has been repeated. Freedom without direction has led to collapse. A striking example is the ecological collapse that began to be debated vigorously at global conferences in the mid-20th century. The first major environmental conference organized by the UN took place in Stockholm in 1972, when scientists and leaders began to recognize that the planet's natural resources were being exploited beyond their sustainable limits. Limits had to be imposed, not out of oppression, but to ensure the continuity of life. Just as in Eden, where a boundary preserved the relationship between man and the Creator, ecological boundaries preserve the relationship between man and creation. This logic holds true. Without containment, freedom degenerates. And when this happens, what was a blessing becomes a threat. The ancient story of the garden is not just about a couple in front of a tree. It is about humanity facing responsibility. Limits are a symbol of love because they require trust. It affirms that the Creator believes in the maturity of human beings to make informed choices. And it is not about blind obedience, but rather an invitation to listen attentively. When one chooses to respect limits, one also chooses to maintain the bond of intimacy with the person who established them. Modern neuroscience also helps us understand why healthy boundaries are essential for human development. Research conducted by neuroscientist Jordan Grafman of the National Institutes of Health in the United States indicates that areas of the brain associated with moral judgment and empathy develop better in contexts where clear rules and loving relationships are present. This reinforces the idea that obedience, when born from a relationship of trust and love, does not repress freedom. On the contrary, it structures it. In the Eden narrative, the silence is broken not only with creative words, but also with instructions. And the impact of these words depends on listening. This listening, in turn, is not only physical, but spiritual. It involves attention, surrender, and memory. man is not only told that he must not eat the fruit, he is warned of the consequences. Death is not threatened as an immediate punishment, but as an inevitable reality if the order is broken. This broadens the understanding of the limit. It is not imposed to restrict, but to protect. Many spiritual traditions agree with this idea. In Jewish thought, for example, the concept of mitzvah, usually translated as commandment, is seen not as a restriction, but as a way of life. They are guidelines that aim to preserve the integrity of existence. The same applies to the rule of the garden. The fruit is not dangerous in itself. What is at risk is the bond between the human and the divine. Freedom is not taken away from a human being when a limit is set. It is, in fact, elevated, because it is not just about deciding between practical options, but about discerning what strengthens or breaks an alliance. This is one of the first lessons that Eden presents. True love does not control, it trusts. And so the Creator does not seal with force, but with words. He does not block access with walls, but with instruction. Even with all the creativity available, it was precisely at that sensitive point that the most profound choice lay. Respecting the limit was to affirm, with gestures, that freedom could exist without breaking harmony. And this, at any time, continues to be one of the most difficult and most valuable decisions we can make. If freedom is exercised without remembering what has been entrusted to us, it can turn into separation. But if it is lived in communion with the one who has set the limits, it becomes one of the greatest testimonies of love. And this is the true weight of the garden, not what was in it, but what could be chosen in it. When a limit is established, it not only guides, it also awakens a silent tension. Even if most possibilities remain open, the existence of a single restriction is enough to raise questions. This inner movement does not arise abruptly. It insinuates itself slowly, as if whispering into a field where before there were only certainties. And it is in this space, between what has been said and what one wishes to understand, that temptation arises. Temptation is not an obvious impulse. It is, in fact, a delicate construction. It begins as a subtle doubt, like a noise that interrupts the calm flow of thought. The trust that once seemed unshakable begins to be questioned. The content of the limit does not change, but the perception of it does. The voice that was once synonymous with care now begins to be reinterpreted. What was protection can now seem like control. And it is this shift that opens gaps in communion. In the garden, this rupture began with an unexpected dialogue. The serpent, a figure that had not appeared until then, introduces a new type of discourse. It does not impose, it suggests. It does not accuse, but insinuates. Its question does not directly contest the order received, but raises a strategic doubt. Is that really what was said? With this phrase, it does not change the rule, but it contaminates the listening. The problem is not in the information, but in its interpretation. This psychological mechanism is as old as it is current. In everyday life, most mistakes do not occur due to ignorance of the rules, but rather due to intentional or convenient distortion of them. This is how doubt enters, not as ignorance, but as an internal review of what was already known. Faced with this doubt, human beings do not lose the ability to choose, but rather begin to rationalize their desire. And in this process, communion is weakened. The breach of trust is always deeper than the violation of the norm, because trust involves a living relationship. When one distrusts the word received, one is not only questioning an instruction, but the integrity of the one who gave it. This makes temptation not just a matter of choice, but a relational crisis. It is the relationship that breaks before the gesture. The action that comes after only manifests what had already broken inside. From a symbolic point of view, the serpent represents more than just an animal. It embodies the cunning of the voice that knows how to manipulate the meaning of things. It does not impose a new law, but rather changes the framework of the previous one. It does not offer a new truth, but rather relativizes the existing one. And that is precisely why its discourse is effective. It does not need to be false to be dangerous. It just needs to be ambiguous. This process has been studied in a variety of contexts. In moral psychology, for example, the concept of cognitive dissonance, developed by Leon Festinger in the 1950s, helps explain why humans try to justify choices they know are wrong. When there is a conflict between what we believe and what we do, the brain tries to adjust its perception to avoid psychological suffering. It is at this point that justifications begin to emerge. Maybe the rule is exaggerated. Maybe the reason for the prohibition is not that serious. And little by little, the mistake stops seeming like a mistake. In Eve's case, the questioning is given form by the serpent's voice, but its strength lies in what already existed within her. Her curiosity, which had been contained until then, finds an echo. The fruit was already known. The tree had been there from the beginning, but only at that moment did it begin to be seen as desirable. This reveals another aspect of temptation. It does not present something new, but rather changes our view of what is already before us. If you've been following along and this message makes sense to you, comment Amen below. This helps to show that you're on this journey together. The narrative makes it clear that there was no coercion. No force was used. What changed was the way Eve interpreted reality. And from that moment on, the communion that had previously been expressed in complete trust began to disintegrate. The Creator's presence did not cease to exist, but his voice was replaced, even if temporarily, by another. This substitution is the core of the breakdown. Listening to another source, even though we know which one is the original. The fruit is not dangerous in itself. The risk lies in the decision to change the way we listen. When another voice takes the place of the main guidance, communion becomes fragile. And when trust is broken, the relationship begins to be built on silence, justifications, and distance. Ava's choice is part of a dynamic we all know, wanting to know more, to understand more, to go beyond limits. But when this search is not anchored in trust, it turns into disordered ambition. It is no longer about growth, but about control. And in this desire for control, simplicity is lost. The breaking of communion, then, does not begin with the act of eating the fruit, but with the change in listening. The doubt, even if small, opened space for a new narrative. And this narrative, however convincing it seemed, did not sustain the original bond. It was a narrative built on distrust. And where there is no trust, the relationship turns into calculation. Thus, the gesture of reaching out for the fruit was not just a physical action. It was the final expression of an internal rupture that had already begun long before. A rupture between freedom and love, between instruction and desire, between the voice that cares and the voice that convinces. And once this space was occupied by another listening, harmony became fragile, and everything that was once communion became risk. The moment the fruit was placed in the mouth was not only the culmination of a choice, but the turning point of the human experience. Until then, everything had existed in balance. The act of eating what had been reserved changed not only the condition of the person who did it, but also the way the world around them began to be perceived. There was no explosion, there was no immediate destruction, but there was silence. A different kind of silence than that which existed before creation. It was a new emptiness, an absence of communion that was announced with intensity. The first effect was not physical, it was internal. Consciousness expanded abruptly. What was once natural became strange. Nudity, which until then had not caused embarrassment, became a burden. The body had not changed, but the way we looked at it had. Shame arose not because of a change in facts, but because of a change in perception. This reveals a fundamental aspect of the fall. It transforms the relationship with oneself. The human being begins to see himself as something separate, fragmented, exposed. From that moment on, what was once full became lacking. Trust gave way to distrust. The space that was once a place of encounter became avoided. The presence of the one who created all things, once familiar, now provoked fear. Fear was not born of punishment, but of separation. It is separation that generates insecurity. Rupture does not require immediate punishment. It manifests itself in the way the world is experienced. The pain that would come in the following days was not limited to the physical. It reached the identity. For the first time, the human being felt the weight of existing outside of communion. Fatigue, hunger, limitation, the hostility of nature, all of this began to be part of the new reality. The garden still exists, but it was no longer accessible in the same way. Not because it had changed, but because the bond that allowed us to live in it in freedom was broken. This transformation is also evident in relationships. The bond between Adam and Eve, previously marked by complicity and lightness, is now tense. There is shared guilt, but also words that attempt to transfer responsibility. The fall affects not only spirituality, but also coexistence. The other, who was previously an extension of one's own existence, is now seen as the cause of error. Communion, now fragmented, reveals its fragility. Where there was once unity, there is now separation. It is in this context that the first experiences of human suffering emerge in its complete form: emotional, physical, and relational. Pain is no longer a distant concept. It is felt in the simplest gestures, such as working the land or creating a life. Creation itself, previously cooperative, becomes challenging. Effort, repetition, and persistence are required, and the result is not always guaranteed. This new scenario does not negate the original beauty of creation, but it makes it harder to perceive. What was once given now needs to be earned. Survival demands constant action. Nature, once welcoming, becomes unpredictable. The elements that sustain life have not ceased to exist, but obtaining them now involves effort and risk. This radically changes the experience of time. The day is no longer just a cycle of light and rest, but a journey of challenges. This process of transformation does not only concern a couple in a garden. It represents a change in condition that begins to mark the entire human experience. From that point on, living also means carrying the weight of discernment. Knowing what is good and evil does not necessarily mean choosing well. It means living with the awareness of one's own decisions, and that, in itself, is already a burden. Knowledge without communion becomes a source of unrest. This now awakened moral consciousness demands answers to questions that did not exist before. Why do things hurt? Why is there injustice? Why do we feel fear? These questions are not just philosophical. They are part of everyday life. They are expressed in gestures, in tears, in silence. The fall gave humanity knowledge, but not peace. It expanded understanding, but it also opened the door to internal conflicts that continue to this day. Realizing they could no longer hide, Adam and Eve heard that voice again. But this time, it did not come just to talk. It came to call, to confront, to reveal. The question, "Where are you?" was not geographic. It was existential. It was a call to acknowledge what had happened. Before restoration could begin, the loss had to be named first. Shame, pain, and division were not imposed from outside. They were direct consequences of the rupture, and so they could not be resolved by an immediate external gesture. It would take time, memory, and above all, a new listening. The human condition from then on has been marked by this double movement: the desire to return to communion and the reality of carrying within oneself the marks of distance. The fall did not destroy human beings, but it revealed their fragility. And from then on, the history of humanity became a long search for meaning, reconciliation, and redemption. Not because the original bond was completely lost, but because it now needs to be rebuilt, step by step, through conscious choices. And each of these choices carries with it the echo of the first. When everything seemed to be falling apart under the weight of disobedience, the voice that echoed in the garden was not one of destruction, but of searching. The question addressed to Adam, simple in form and profound in meaning, sounded more like a call than an accusation. It contained more than curiosity. It carried the intention of restoration. It was the beginning of something new. Even though the covenant had been broken, the initiative to seek out the human being came from the one who had been rejected. This gesture reveals an essential aspect of divine justice. It is not opposed to love, but is born of it. The judgment that followed was neither arbitrary nor angry. It was precise, proportionate, and didactic. Each consequence mentioned was directly related to the breach committed. For the woman, the pain of childbirth and the tension in relationships. For the man, the weight of work and the resistance of the earth. For the serpent, the condemnation of crawling and permanent hostility. But beyond the consequences, there was a hidden promise. A seed of hope was planted in the middle of the sentence. The woman's offspring would one day crush the tempter's head. Justice at that moment came accompanied by an announcement of redemption. This point marks an important distinction between retributive justice and restorative justice. The former merely punishes. The latter corrects with a view to reconciliation. The Creator did not abandon his creation. He clothed Adam and Eve in garments made of skin, a gesture that not only covered their nakedness, but symbolized care in the midst of their pain. Even after the breakdown, their dignity was preserved. This detail is fundamental. Divine justice does not erase the fall, but offers a path to rise again from it. This combination of correction and compassion has become a pattern repeated throughout history. Whenever there has been error, there has also been a call. When the bond has been broken, the divine response has not been complete withdrawal, but rather the building of bridges. This principle of approach is what sets divine action apart from the common human responses to failure. While human instinct often opts for withdrawal or severe punishment, the narrative shows a Creator who draws near even in the face of rejection. The removal from the garden, though painful, was not a gesture of total rejection. It was a protective measure. If the tree of life had remained accessible after the fall, human existence could have perpetuated itself in a condition of rupture. Exile was necessary, not as a cruel punishment, but as a provisional step until the path of healing was ready. This view contrasts with many simplistic readings of justice as punishment. Here, it appears as part of a larger plan. In the history of Western thought, justice has always been debated. Philosophers such as Aristotle, in the 4th century BC, understood justice as giving each person what is due to them. But even this concept, although important, does not encompass the full depth of what the Eden story proposes. The Creator does not simply deliver consequences. He supports those who have erred. He does not nullify the relationship. He reshapes it, allowing it to be rebuilt. This process of reconstruction would require time, memory, and faith. Humanity, upon leaving Eden, carries not only the weight of error, but also the echo of promise. There is a path ahead, marked by effort, yes, but also by reunions. What defines this journey is not only the past of failure, but the possibility of a redemptive future. The Creator does not only look at what was lost, He points to what can still be restored. Divine compassion, in this context, does not ignore the gravity of the choice made, but neither does it reduce the human being to his error. This balance is difficult to find in human relationships, but it is the foundation of the sacred narrative. Justice is necessary, but it cannot be imposed without mercy. And mercy does not nullify responsibility. Together, they pave the way for a true restoration, which does not ignore the past, but transforms it. The beginning of the journey of redemption, therefore, does not happen only when the couple leaves the garden. It begins the moment when, even after having failed, they hear the voice of the Creator again. This voice, which previously announced life and order, now speaks with wounded but still loving tenderness. This continuity of dialogue is the basis of hope, because where there is communication, there is still relationship. And where there is relationship, there is the possibility of return. The path out of the garden is arid, but it is paved with the promise that the fall will not be the last word. The Creator who formed human beings with His own hands has not definitively departed. He remains present, even when proximity needs to be different. The gesture of covering, the calling by name, the promise of a descendant who will overcome evil, all of this points to a plan that has not been interrupted, only expanded. Justice in this scenario was not the negation of love. It was its most firm expression. And compassion was not the absence of correction, but the way in which it was carried out. Thus, even in the midst of pain and distance, the narrative remains open. Because the end of the garden is not the end of the story, but the opening of a new path. A path marked not by condemnation, but by the ongoing search for reconciliation. Even after the garden was closed and the inevitable separation, the essential bond between the Creator and his work was not broken. Adam and Eve's departure did not symbolize an absolute rupture, but rather the beginning of a new phase of existence. Freedom, which had been exercised in an erroneous way, now began to coexist with its consequences. However, the story is not limited to loss. It expands in unexpected ways, revealing that the fall did not nullify the value of creation, but merely redesigned its trajectory. The world they were led to was different. The land, once docile, now demanded effort. Time, once merely contemplative, began to carry the weight of the seasons, of waiting, of work, and of loss. But even in this changed scenario, there were still traces of the original breath. The memory of the garden was not erased. It survived as a deep memory, as a longing for a state of plenitude that, although distant, still echoed within each human being. This memory was expressed not only in words or feelings, but in everyday gestures. The care for the land, the birth of children, the desire for justice, and the drive to seek what is good. All of these pointed to something greater, something that had been known, and that in some way could still be found again. The journey out of Eden was not only physical, it also represented the inner path of the human being toward himself, toward the other, and toward that which transcends both. Over the generations, this search has taken on different forms. It has appeared in laws that sought to organize coexistence, in stories that transmitted wisdom, in songs that spoke of longing and hope. In different cultures and eras, attempts have been made to rebuild what had been lost. Not always clearly, not always successfully, but always with this urge to return. The absence of perfection has not eliminated the desire for it. Separation has not extinguished the thirst for reconnection. The most impressive thing about this journey is that the response was never just one-sided. Human beings sought, but they were also sought. The Creator was still present, even if in less visible ways. His voice, now heard among the noise of history, continued to call, restore, transform. And even when it seemed that everything was dark, some light remained lit. A light that did not come from human strength, but from a promise that had been made from the beginning. This promise was not vague. It indicated that redemption would come from within humanity itself. That one day, from the wounded lineage, someone would emerge capable of restoring what was broken. This hope, even if whispered, has sustained people, families, and hearts throughout the centuries. Because it was not just a return to the physical garden, but an internal restoration, a reunion with that which gives meaning to life. The fall taught us that freedom without alliance leads to dispersion, that knowledge without listening becomes a burden, that living without love turns into arid survival. But it also revealed that human fragility is not synonymous with definitive failure. On the contrary, it is from it that the path to maturity, awareness, and faith is built. The Creator did not erase what he had done. He initiated a deeper process where each stage of history carries the potential for reconciliation. Today, even in a world far removed from that initial garden, we continue to carry within us the tension between rupture and search. In each choice, we repeat, in a certain way, that fundamental moment. We hear voices, we feel the weight of doubts, we recognize limits, but we are also called. We are reminded that, despite the distance, there is still a path of return. not a return that nullifies what we were, but one that redeems what we have become. And that is precisely where the narrative gains its greatest strength. It does not hold us back from the past, but invites us to look forward with responsibility and hope. Eden, although closed, has not been forgotten. It continues to live on in the memory of what is fair, beautiful, and true. And in every gesture of care, in every ethical decision, in every sincere search for reconciliation, we touch, even if only for a moment, the reality of this lost place. The true power of this story lies not in what was lost, but in what can be built from the loss. Dignity was not nullified, the covenant was not discarded, the presence of the Creator did not disappear, it simply changed form. Now it is found in the silent search, in the insistent hope, in the courage to move on, even with scars. And it is in this movement that the story continues. Because there are questions that span the centuries. There are choices that define us. And there is a call that never goes silent. Life, even when wounded, can still be redeemed. And perhaps it is precisely this possibility that makes the journey, even outside the garden, so profoundly human. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.